on the morning of April the 5th, 1909. Readers in Arizona opened their newspaper to a story about a hidden world inside the Grand Canyon, a cave carved high into a cliff face, reachable only by boat, opening into a complex of underground chambers 1,000 feet deep. Preserved mummies seated upright, copper tools and weapons, statues that looked more like Egypt or Asia than anything anyone expected in the American Southwest, and walls covered in symbols no one could read. The explorer named in the article said he was working on a government expedition tied to the Smithsonian. 4 days later, the paper ran a second story with more detail, and then it stopped. No photographs were ever published, no artifacts ever appeared in a museum. The expedition that had supposedly made one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in American history simply vanished from the record. But here is the part that makes this more than a forgotten newspaper hoax. Long before that article ran, long before the canyon was a national park, long before any explorer claimed to find a cave, the Hopi people were already telling a story about a world beneath the Grand Canyon, underground chambers where their ancestors once lived, and beings who were there before them, tall, covered in hair, dwelling deep below the canyon floor. Not a myth of the afterlife. A memory of a place. I'm Julian Crane, an archaeologist the establishment pushed out when I started asking the questions my colleagues wouldn't. So on this channel, I dig up the history they left out. If that's the sort of thing you want more of, consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always change your mind later. Now let's get into what the Hopi said was living beneath the Grand Canyon, and why a newspaper in 1909 seemed to describe the very same place. Start with the Hopi, because they were there first, by centuries. For the Hopi, the story beneath the canyon was never simply a legend, it was history. Their oldest oral traditions describe humanity passing through a series of worlds before arriving in the one we know. The present world, in that telling, is not the first. Earlier worlds ended in great catastrophes, and each time the survivors were guided to safety before eventually emerging into a new age. That emergence is one of the foundations of Hopi belief, and the place where it happened has a name, the Sipapu. A sacred opening through which the ancestors came up into the present world after living below the earth. And unlike so many creation stories, this one is tied to a real landscape, not a symbolic heaven, a specific place in the country of northern Arizona. And what makes the Hopi telling unusual is how concrete it stays. The tradition does not speak of a vague spirit realm. It speaks of chambers beneath the land, of long migrations through underground passages, of routes and destinations, of guides who already knew those hidden places before the Hopi ancestors ever set foot in them. These were carried and taught as history, held and passed down through the clan system, which is its own kind of archive. Written records can burn or be lost. Hopi knowledge survived through continuous oral transmission, kept alive by elders whose specific responsibility was to remember and to teach the history of their people accurately, generation after generation. That is not a small thing. A tradition guarded that way, for that long, by people whose whole role is to keep it from drifting, is not the same as a campfire story that grows in the telling. But the part that pulls hardest at me is what the ancestors were said to have found down there before that journey was complete. According to the Bear Clan, whose oral history preserves many of the oldest Hopi traditions, there were already beings living beneath the earth when the ancestors arrived. The Hopi called them the Ant People, and despite the name, the descriptions do not sound like insects at all. They are remembered as intelligent beings who lived inside underground chambers and knew the world below the surface far better than the ancestors did. During times of catastrophe, when the earlier worlds were destroyed, these beings sheltered the ancestors, they protected them. They kept them alive until it was safe to emerge again. And some traditions describe them as taller than ordinary people. Others remember them as covered in hair. And nearly all of them agree on one thing. They lived beneath the canyon, in the underground world, rather than in the villages the Hopi would later build on the mesas above. Different versions of the tradition carry different details, the way any account does after generations of retelling, but the same themes surface again and again. Beings larger than ordinary people, beings covered in hair, beings who belong to the world below. To the Hopi, none of this was entertainment. It was part of their history and their identity, and anthropologists who studied it generally treated it as an element of Hopi cosmology and religious tradition, which is a respectful frame, but also a frame that gently sets aside the possibility that any of it describes something that was physically there. These accounts were carried by mouth, generation to generation, long before any anthropologist wrote them down, with no connection at all to newspapers or archaeology or government expeditions. And then, in the spring of 1909, a newspaper printed something that sounded uncannily like them. The explorer the Arizona Gazette named was a man it called G.E. Kincaid, who identified himself as working on a government-sponsored expedition associated with the Smithsonian, under an archaeologist the paper called Professor S.A. Jordan. The entrance to the cave, the article said, sat hundreds of feet up an almost vertical cliff, reachable only from the river. And what Kincaid claimed to have found inside was extraordinary, a central passage running more than 1,000 feet, with dozens of chambers branching off it. Rooms of preserved grain, rooms of pottery and copper and carved figures. Mummies seated upright rather than laid flat, carefully wrapped. Statues in a style the article compared to Egypt and the Orient, rather than anything from prehistoric North America. And inscriptions on the walls that neither Kincaid nor the expedition's archaeologists could identify. The second article, 4 days later, did not treat the first as a joke or a rumor. It expanded on it, describing the layout and the collection of artifacts as though a genuine discovery were unfolding. To a reader in 1909, it did not sound like fiction. It sounded like the announcement of something that might rewrite the history of the Southwest. And the detail is the thing I keep turning over, because it cuts both ways. A hoax writer will often add detail to sell the illusion, so specificity alone proves nothing. But the specifics here are odd ones: measurements of chambers, the seated posture of the mummies, the exact character of the artwork, references to a cliff face location that genuinely is difficult to reach. It reads less like a tall tale spun for excitement and more like a survey, written flat, as though the writer were recording rather than inventing. That does not make it true. A skilled fabricator can imitate that tone deliberately, but it is not the register a hoax usually reaches for, and it is worth noticing rather than waving away. Then it stopped. No photographs, no artifacts, no scientific report. The expedition that had supposedly made the find seemed to disappear as quickly as it had arrived. And that disappearance is where the trouble begins, because when researchers went looking for the records, they found almost nothing. The Smithsonian has consistently stated that it has no record of a G.E. Kincaid ever being employed by the institution, no record of a Professor S.A. Jordan connected to any such expedition, and no record of artifacts matching those in the articles. For many historians, that settles it. An elaborate newspaper fabrication, nothing more. And I want to be honest with you, because this is a story where honesty matters more than usual. That is a real possibility, and it may be the correct one. Newspapers in that era did sometimes run sensational inventions alongside their ordinary reporting. The absence of a single artifact, the absence of a single photograph, the Smithsonian's flat denial of the names, all of that weighs heavily on the side of a hoax. But it does not close the case, for a few reasons worth laying out plainly. The newspaper itself is real. Both the April 5th and April 9th editions unquestionably exist, and researchers have verified that both articles were genuinely published in 1909. The mystery was never whether the paper printed the story. The mystery is whether the events it described actually happened, and those are two very different questions. In that same period, legitimate archaeological discoveries were also frequently announced, first in newspapers, before any formal scientific paper appeared. Simply being in print did not prove a discovery, but neither did it disprove one. And there is a detail of timing that is easy to miss. Only 3 years before the article, the Antiquities Act of 1906 had become law, giving the federal government authority over significant archaeological finds on federal land. The Grand Canyon was already under federal protection, which means any major discovery there would have fallen under federal oversight, and the Smithsonian did frequently work with government agencies on exactly that kind of investigation in exactly that period. So the newspaper's reference to a government-tied expedition is not, on its own, absurd. It fits the machinery of the time, even though no expedition records have ever been confirmed. Later researchers turned up other fragments, and I want to be careful with them because none of them is proof. Some reported finding scattered references to a man named G.E. Kincaid in unrelated historical records, which suggests a person by that name may have existed, though that is a long way from confirming the expedition. Others pointed to gaps in the archival collections from the period, though missing records can happen for 100 ordinary reasons, from incomplete preservation to simple loss over a century. I am not going to dress any of that up as more than it is. None of it, by itself, confirms the cave. What it does is keep the case from closing cleanly in either direction. More than a century later, the story sits suspended between two possibilities. Either the Arizona Gazette published one of the most detailed archaeological hoaxes of its time, or it reported on an expedition whose full history was never recovered. And here is where it becomes genuinely interesting, rather than merely unresolved. Because when you set the newspaper's description beside something that already existed long before 1909, the parallels become difficult to ignore. The Hopi had been describing underground chambers and unusual beings beneath the Grand Canyon for generations. A newspaper describes hidden chambers deep inside the canyon. The Hopi describe an underground world beneath the canyon. The newspaper reports preserved remains and unexplored passages. The Hopi remember ancient beings who lived below the surface long before the present age. And this raises a simple but critical question. Could two completely different sources, one a newspaper printed in 1909 and the other an oral tradition preserved for centuries before it, be pointing at the same place? I want to be clear that the parallel does not prove the newspaper true. It is entirely possible that whoever wrote the article knew the Hopi traditions and borrowed from them, dressing an old story in the costume of a scientific expedition. That is a real explanation, and it deserves to sit on the table beside the others. But the question does not go away just because it has an innocent answer available. And the canyon itself adds a layer that most people never consider. The Grand Canyon is not a single open valley. It is a landscape riddled with extensive natural cave systems, especially within the formation geologists call the Red Wall limestone. Many of those cave networks remain extremely difficult to reach. And even today, large portions of the canyon's cliffs and caves have never been comprehensively explored or mapped. That does not prove the 1909 cave exists, but it does mean that the canyon is far larger, far deeper, and far more hidden than the view from the rim ever suggests. The Red Wall limestone alone contains extensive cave systems, many of them impossible to reach without specialized climbing or a river expedition, and much of that underground landscape has simply never been fully explored or mapped in detail. We tend to assume that a place this famous, this photographed, this walked over by millions of visitors must be thoroughly known. It is not. The rim is known. The trails are known. The dark spaces inside the stone, the ledges hundreds of feet up a sheer wall, the passages that run back into the rock, most of those have never had a human being in them, or have not since long before any of us were born. Most visitors experience only that rim, looking down across one of the most studied landscapes on Earth. Beneath those cliffs is an intricate world of caves and ledges and narrow passages carved over millions of years, much of it still dark, still unentered, still unrecorded. Perhaps that is why this story refuses to die, not because anyone has proven what lies beneath the canyon, but because no one has been able to completely answer the question either. Then there is the Hopi position, which changes the shape of the whole thing. In the year 2000, the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office issued a statement concerning sacred places within the Grand Canyon. It did not confirm the Arizona Gazette story. It did not try to validate any claim connected to it. What it did was ask for something different. It emphasized that certain locations inside the canyon are spiritually significant and are not appropriate for public investigation. It asked for respect, and whatever you make of the 1909 article, that request carries its own quiet weight. A people do not ask the world to stay away from empty ground. And that distinction matters because across this entire story we are looking at three very different kinds of evidence: a newspaper report, archaeological and geological knowledge about the canyon, and an oral tradition carefully preserved within Hopi culture for generations. Each one tells part of the story. Not one of them, by itself, settles the question. History is rarely that clean. Sometimes a discovery answers old questions. Sometimes it only creates new ones. The Grand Canyon has done both. It has revealed villages, trails, and sacred places that transformed our understanding of the Southwest, and at the same time it continues to guard places that remain beyond easy reach. Perhaps one day a new tool will settle it. High-resolution laser mapping from the air, advanced cave surveying, some future archaeological method may finally reach the places we cannot reach now and either produce the chamber or prove its absence. Or perhaps the answer was never hidden inside the canyon at all. Perhaps it has always been sitting in the stories of the people who knew this landscape long before newspapers, government surveys, or national parks existed. That is the possibility the tidy version never even entertains, and it may be the most important one. So what do we actually have when the sensational parts are set aside? We have a newspaper account with no surviving photographs, no field notes, and no recovered artifacts. We have a firm Smithsonian denial of the names it printed. We have a canyon honeycombed with thousands of caves, most of them never surveyed. And we have an indigenous tradition, older than the newspaper, older than the state of Arizona, that had been describing an underground world and the beings who lived in it for generations before anyone printed a word about a cave. None of those things prove the others, but laid side by side, they refuse to resolve into a simple answer. If the article described a genuine expedition, where are the photographs and the artifacts? And if it was purely an invention, why was it written with such specific detail, with measurements of chambers and descriptions of artifacts and references to locations that are difficult to reach even now? History has not given us a clean answer to either question. And I want to resist the pull that both sides feel here, the pull to force a verdict. The debunker wants it to be a hoax, and only a hoax, because that is tidy. The believer wants it to be a hidden Egyptian city, because that is thrilling. But the honest position is the uncomfortable middle. We have a real newspaper, a real denial, a real canyon full of unmapped caves, and a real tradition older than all of it, and they do not add up to a conclusion. They add up to a question that has stayed open for more than 100 years, which is a rarer and more interesting thing than an answer. Hi, I'm Julian Crane. I will not tell you there is a lost Egyptian city hidden in the walls of the Grand Canyon, because I cannot show it to you, and no one else has been able to either. What I can tell you is that the tidy dismissal, the one that files the whole thing under hoax and walks away, leaves too much on the table. It does not explain why the Hopi were describing an underground world and tall, hair-covered beings beneath that exact canyon long before any newspaper existed to borrow from. It does not account for a landscape so vast that we have not finished mapping our own backyard. And it does not settle the strange fact that two sources with nothing to do with each other, separated by centuries, seem to be pointing at the same dark place under the same stone. The Hopi have never claimed to hold every answer. What they have preserved is a memory of emerging from below the earth, a memory of underground chambers, and a memory of beings who were already down there when the ancestors began their climb into the present world. Those traditions have survived longer than the newspaper, longer than the state, longer than any investigation into 1909. So the next time you stand at the rim and look down, do not just admire the view. Ask what the people who lived here longest have always said is underneath it, and why every generation keeps coming back to the same cliffs to ask the same question. What, if anything, still lies hidden beneath them? I'll see you in the next one.